The day all the elderly disappeared and only one child was missing began on an ordinary Thursday morning. 8-year-old João woke up and realized his grandfather wasn't in the kitchen making coffee with too much sugar. He ran downstairs shouting "Grandpa" and found only silence. He ran out into the street and discovered something terrifying. There were no elderly people anywhere. Canes were abandoned on the sidewalks. Rocking chairs rocked empty. The medicines remained on the nightstands, but their owners had simply disappeared. João was the only one who noticed. The adults went about their lives as normal, as if the elderly had never existed. If you've ever felt like the elderly in your family are invisible to the world, leave a like. Their loneliness needs to resonate. Subscribe and comment with the name of the elderly person you don't want to disappear from your life, because this story will reveal something hauntingly real about how we treat our elders. João knew something terrible had happened when he arrived at school and saw that the senior class that always took a walk in the courtyard was missing. He looked for Mr. Eduardo, the retired doorman who always gave him mints. "Where's Mrs. Sebastiana, who sold popcorn at the door? Where's Mr. Manuel, who fixed bikes on the corner?" he asked the teacher, his classmates, and his parents as he left school. Everyone looked at him strangely, as if he were talking about imaginary people. "What, Grandpa John? What, Mr. Edward? There never was a Mrs. Sebastiana here." It was as if the collective memory had been erased from all adults, as if a giant eraser had passed through the city, eliminating any trace that people over 65 had ever existed. But João remembered. João missed them, and that made him the sole survivor of a catastrophe no one else could see. The question that tormented him was, how could an entire world forget people who were there yesterday? João Henrique Pereira was 8 years old and had a memory that worked differently than adults. While adults remembered important things like meetings, bills to pay, and work commitments, João retained details no one else considered relevant. How his grandpa would cut the apple peel into a perfect spiral, how Rosa from the bakery always asked if he wanted an extra cookie, how Antonio from the newspaper knew the name of every dog on the street. For João, these people weren't just part of the urban landscape. They were fundamental characters in his personal history. Grandpa Oswaldo was the one who drove him to school every day, telling him crazy stories about when he was a child and the world was black and white. Literally black and white, according to Grandpa, who showed old photos as proof. He was the one who taught João how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bike without training wheels, how to make paper boats that sailed down the gutter on rainy days. For 8 years, Grandpa was the most reliable constant in João's life, more present than his always busy parents, more patient than his always rushed teachers, more entertaining than any television show. João didn't know he was living in a golden age that would end without warning, that he would wake up in a world where his favorite person would simply cease to exist, not just physically, but in everyone's memories. The morning started strangely from the moment João opened his eyes. I usually woke to the sound of Grandpa stirring pots in the kitchen and the smell of strong coffee wafting up the stairs. But there was a different silence in the house, a kind of stillness that seemed to have a weight of its own. João came downstairs in his pajamas, expecting to find Grandpa reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, like every morning for the past 8 years. The table was empty. The chair where Grandpa always sat was propped upright, as if it had never been used. João searched the entire house, Grandpa's room, the garden where he watered the plants, the garage, where he fixed broken things. Nothing, not even the distinctive smell of the blood pressure medication Grandpa took religiously after breakfast. It was then that João noticed something even stranger. There were no signs that Grandpa had left the house. His slippers were in place, his cane leaned against the wall, his glasses on the nightstand, as if he had simply dissolved into thin air during the night. Joan felt the first tightness in his chest that indicated something very serious was happening. Something his 8-year-old mind couldn't yet fully process, but his heart already understood. Grandpa had disappeared in a way that seemed definitive and inexplicable. And that's when he started disappearing. Not just Grandpa, every single old person in town. Joan discovered this when his mother came home from work and he rushed to tell her about Grandpa's disappearance. "Mom, Grandpa's gone!" he shouted, expecting to see the panic in her eyes. But his mother just looked at him with confusion. "What Grandpa, Joan? You don't have a grandpa." The answer hit Joan like a punch in the gut. "What do you mean I don't have a grandpa? Grandpa Oswaldo. Who lives here with us? Who makes coffee every morning?" His mother crouched down to his level with that expression adults make when they think a child is making things up. "Joan, son, you never had a grandpa living here. Your grandparents died before you were born, remember?" But Joan didn't remember that at all. He remembered 8 years of stories, games, walks, conversations. He remembered Grandpa's smell, his husky voice, his large, rough hands that always found a caress at bedtime. How could his own mother have forgotten her father? How could she not feel the glaring absence of that presence that filled the entire house? Joan realized something was terribly wrong, and he was apparently the only person in the world who could see the truth. No one saw him anymore, but he still moved from room to room. Joan spent the entire day searching for evidence that Grandpa had ever existed. Family photos, gifts he'd given, anything that would prove he wasn't making up an entire person. But it was as if an invisible force had systematically erased any trace of Grandpa Oswaldo's existence. The photos that once showed 3 people now showed only Joan and his parents. Grandpa's closet was empty, but no one thought it strange to have an empty closet in the guest room. The medicines were gone, but no one remembered having any medicine there. Joan found only one piece of evidence, a paper boat under the bed, the kind Grandpa had taught him to make. But when he showed it to his parents, they said Joan had probably learned how to make it in school or seen it on television. Reality was being rewritten live, and Joan was the only one still with access to the original version. He left the house in despair and went to see if the same thing had happened to other elderly people in the neighborhood. Donna Carmen, who always swept the sidewalk, was gone. Mr. Francisco, who fixed cars in the garage, had disappeared along with the garage. The lady who fed the street cats was gone, and the cats were wandering around lost, meowing as if searching for someone no one could remember. There was a memory that Joan kept like a secret treasure, the most precious proof that Grandpa had been real. It was from a rainy Sunday 3 months ago. Joan was sad because he couldn't go out to play in the park. Grandpa found him looking out the window with a dejected expression and said, "Come here, grandson. I'll teach you how to make rain indoors." Joan thought Grandpa had gone crazy, but he followed him into the kitchen. Grandpa filled a large pot with water, took a clear cup, turned it upside down and dipped it into the water. When he lifted the cup, it was full of air. "See, I captured a cloud," he said, blinking. Then he taught Joan how to make lightning through the cup of water with a flashlight and thunder by banging spoons against pots. They spent the entire afternoon playing Storm in the kitchen, laughing like crazy. At the end, Grandpa said, "See, Joan, we can make any weather we want. We just need to use our imagination." That afternoon was perfect. It was magic. It was real. Joan could still taste the hot chocolate they'd had afterward, still hear Grandpa's sweet laughter echoing through the kitchen. But now everyone said he'd made it up. Children really do have imagination. That there was no Grandpa to play with him in the rain. The memory remained intact in Joan's mind, bright and indisputable, but it had become an orphaned memory, a memory without witnesses, a treasure only he could see. The school became a laboratory of terrifying discoveries. Joan realized it wasn't just his family who had forgotten the elderly, it was everyone. The seniors group that used to walk in the courtyard every morning was gone, but no one thought it was strange that the courtyard was empty. Mr. Eduardo, the retired doorman who always chatted with the children at the entrance, was no longer there. But when Joan asked the principal, she said they'd never had a doorman named Eduardo. "It's always just been Mrs. Marcia in the office," she explained matter-of-factly. Joan looked for Mrs. Sebastiana, who was selling popcorn at the school gate. Her cart wasn't there, and when he asked other parents, they all looked as if he were talking about an imaginary person. "There's never been anyone." "Selling popcorn here, son," a mother said with forced patience. "You must have been dreaming." But John hadn't dreamed. He remembered perfectly the taste of sweet popcorn, the conversations he'd had with Donna Sebastiana about the television shows she watched, how she'd always save an extra bag for him on the days he forgot to bring money. During recess, Joan sat alone on the bench where he used to chat with Mr. Manuel, the man who repaired bicycles and told stories about his time as a professional cyclist. The bench was empty, abandoned, as if it had never been used for meetings between a curious boy and an old man full of stories to tell. The city wasn't banning the elderly, it was just pretending they weren't there anymore. Joan discovered this when he decided to systematically canvass the neighborhood. He went to the bakery where Donna Rosa always gave him extra cookies. The bakery was operating normally, but with different employees. "There's never been a Donna Rosa here," the new baker said when Joan asked. "This bakery has always been mine." Joan went to the newsstand where Mr. Antonio knew all the youngsters by name. The stand was closed, with a "for rent" sign that looked like it had been there for months. When he asked the man next door about Mr. Antonio, the man said the spot had been empty for years. "There's never been a newsstand there, kid. You must be confusing it with another street." But John wasn't confusing anything. He knew that street like the back of his hand. He knew exactly where every elderly person lived, worked, and spent their time, and they had all simply disappeared. Not just physically, but from collective memory, as if a giant eraser had passed over the city, erasing any evidence that people over 65 had ever existed there. Joan began to understand that he was witnessing something much bigger than his grandfather's disappearance. He was witnessing the systematic elimination of an entire generation, and apparently he was the only one who could still remember they had existed. Being a child here wasn't an advantage, it was a responsibility. Joan discovered that his ability to remember the elderly came with a weight he didn't know how to carry. How to explain to adults that they had forgotten entire people. How to convince parents, teachers, and neighbors that there existed a ghost population that only he could see in his memory. Joan tried different approaches. He drew his grandfather and showed it to his mother. She found the drawing beautiful and said, "What a fertile imagination you have, son." He told detailed stories about the missing elderly to any adult who would listen. Everyone reacted the same way, with that condescending patience reserved for childhood fantasies. "How creative! You should write books. What an imaginative mind!" No one took him seriously. No one investigated. No one missed him. Joan realized he had become the only living archive of an entire generation that had been erased, not only from reality but from collective memory. It was a huge responsibility for an 8-year-old, keeping alive the memories of people no one else could remember, being the sole witness to entire lives that had been edited out of history. And the scariest thing was the thought. If he forgot, if his memory failed, if he grew up and lost the ability to remember, these people would disappear forever, definitely, as if they had never existed. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted someone to believe him, João wasn't making up stories for fun or trying to get attention. He was desperately trying to preserve the memory of real people who had meant everything to him. Grandpa Oswaldo wasn't just a figure in João's imagination. He was the man who had taught him that the world was full of hidden magic, who had shown him that love didn't need complicated words, just a constant presence, who had made João feel like the most important person in the universe every morning for 8 years. But now João was discovering that it didn't matter how real these people had been, how important they had been, how much of a difference they had made. If no one else could remember them, it was as if they had never existed. João was learning a cruel lesson that even adults can't easily process, that existence depends not only on having lived, but on being remembered, that a person can die twice, first when they stop breathing, then when the last person who remembered them forgets. And seemingly, every elderly person in town had died this second death in a single night. Everyone, except in the memory of an 8-year-old boy no one took seriously. João didn't know how, but he felt he had become responsible for keeping these people alive, for not letting the second death be final, for screaming, drawing, telling stories, insisting even when no one believed him. In the city of the forgotten, he knew he would be the next to forget. João began to fear sleeping. What if he woke up the next day and had also forgotten Grandpa? What if the same force that had erased the memories of all the adults came looking for you in the night? He began writing down everything he could remember about each missing elderly person. In the crooked handwriting of an 8-year-old, he wrote stories about Grandpa Oswaldo, how he made coffee, what stories he told, how he smelled after a shower. He wrote about Donna Rosa from the bakery, about Mr. Eduardo from school, about all the old people who had vanished from reality but still lived in his memory. He kept everything under his mattress, like a secret treasure he needed to protect. Because João had understood something terrible. He wasn't special. He didn't have magical powers. He wasn't immune to forgetting. He was just a child, and children grow up, and perhaps when he grew up, he would also lose the ability to remember. Perhaps the memory of the elderly was a temporary gift, something only small children could hold on to. João looked at the adults around him and wondered, did they also remember the elderly when they were children? Had they all once been like him, the only ones able to see what the grown-ups couldn't? And if so, what happened to those memories when we grew up? Did they simply disappear, like the elderly themselves had disappeared? The silence of the house tasted of longing. João hadn't known what longing tasted like until Grandpa disappeared. Now he knew. It was bitter as medicine, sweet as the sugar. Grandpa put too much in his coffee, and heavy as the blanket he used to cover himself when he slept on the couch watching television. The house had lost its most important sounds. The sound of Grandpa's slippers shuffling down the hallway in the early hours of the morning when he went to the bathroom, the morning clearing of his throat that announced he was waking up, the clink of the spoon in the sugar bowl every morning. João discovered that it's not just people who are missed when they disappear. It's all the little noises they made, all the smells they left behind, all the objects they touched that now seemed like useless orphans. He sat in the chair where Grandpa drank coffee and tried to feel the warmth that should still be there. He rummaged through the drawers, searching for some trace everyone else had forgotten to erase, but he found nothing. Reality had been edited with surgical perfection. João began having imaginary conversations with Grandpa, telling him about his day at school, what grade he got on his math test, what new friend he'd made. He talked to himself in his room as if Grandpa were listening. And maybe he was. Maybe the forgotten became invisible, but they didn't truly disappear. Maybe they were still there, nearby, waiting for someone to remember them so they could come back into existence. He still expected to find Grandpa in the kitchen. Every morning, João woke with a glimmer of hope that it had all been a bad nightmare, that he would go downstairs and find Grandpa stirring the sugar bowl, reading the newspaper, complaining about the bad news in that husky voice Joan loved. But every morning the kitchen was empty, silent, cold. And every morning Joan felt his heart breaking a little more. He didn't understand how the world could continue to function normally without the elderly. How adults managed to live their lives without feeling the giant void the elderly had left. It was as if an entire color had vanished from the world. But only Joan could notice that now everything was less colorful. Joan began to develop a childish theory. Maybe the elderly weren't really gone. Maybe they were somewhere else in a parallel dimension where only children could sometimes see them. Maybe Donna Rosa was still baking cookies, Mr. Eduardo was still telling jokes at the reception, Grandpa Oswaldo was still making coffee with too much sugar, and maybe, if Joan tried hard enough, if he believed hard enough, if he never forgot, he could find the door between the two worlds. He could bring them all back. He could prove to the adults that the elderly weren't disposable, that they mattered, that they were missed, that they deserved to be remembered forever, not just by an 8-year-old no one took seriously. Joan still lives in the same house where Grandpa Oswaldo disappeared one Thursday morning. He still wakes up every day expecting to find him in the kitchen. He still keeps under his mattress the stories he wrote about all the elderly people who disappeared. But Joan understood something that even adults can't, that there is a death worse than physical death. It's the death of memory. It's when someone ceases to exist, not because they're dead, but because they've been forgotten. It's when a person becomes so irrelevant to the world that even their absence ceases to be noticed. The city where all the elderly disappeared isn't science fiction. It's our reality disguised as metaphor. Every time we ignore an elderly person, in the bank line, every time we talk about them as if they weren't present, every time we treat their stories as inconvenient, we're participating in this collective disappearance. We're erasing people who were once young, who built the world we live in, who loved and were loved. Joan looks out the window and sees a city full of adults, too busy to miss those who are no longer there. And he understands that perhaps his mission is to grow up without forgetting, to be the adult who can still see the invisible, who still hears the voices of the forgotten, who still remembers that love has no expiration date and that longing is proof that someone was important. The question that echoes through the empty room where Grandpa should be has no easy answer. How many elderly people are disappearing from our lives every day without us noticing? And when did we decide that aging was synonymous with becoming disposable? If you know a child who misses an elderly person the world has forgotten, write that child's name in the comments. Like, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. This isn't just a video, it's a reminder of who we're silently losing. Perhaps a memory here in the comments will bring someone back to the collective memory.